Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the Interventional Psychiatry Consortium, an educational network bringing together trainees and other advanced learners for a shared educational experience in the rapidly growing field of neuromodulation. My name is Ailani. I'm one of the organizers of the consortium, alongside Yaakov, Jeff Zabinski, and Jarrod, Ehrie, as well as our amazing advisory board. Before we begin today's talk, we'd like to take a moment to remember Dr. Nolan Williams, a true trailblazer in the field of interventional psychiatry. Dr. Williams was a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University and director of the Stanford Brain Stimulation Lab. He pioneered the same protocol that transformed how we think about TMS and the pace of recovery in depression, and also led work with Ibogaine for trauma, brain injury, and depression. Beyond his work, he was known to many as a humble, kind, and compassionate human being, someone whose presence inspired the next generation of clinicians in this field. Many members of our consortium were fortunate to call him a colleague, mentor, and friend. Though his passing was a profound loss, his legacy remains. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for showing us what the future of our field can be. With that, we'll now turn to today's session. Today is the fifth talk in an incredible lineup of speakers covering a variety of topics, as you can see here. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive invitations to future events, and also take a moment to complete our brief survey. As for today, we'll soon hear from our speaker. Then we'll have a Q&A, during which time you can use the chat to ask a question or raise your hand to be unmuted. The sessions are recorded and will be made available to you all. Now, I am thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Linda Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a professor of psychiatry at the Alpert Medical School of Brown University and chief of the Mood Disorders Program at Butler Hospital. She directs the hospital's TMS clinic and neuromodulation research facility, where her team conducts pioneering studies using brain stimulation techniques to advance treatment for depression and other disorders. Her research has focused on understanding the neurobiology of mood and anxiety disorders, the biological impact of early life stress, and the development of novel therapeutics, including transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, and deep brain stimulation. She recently led a multi-center randomized control trial investigating a novel home-use neuromodulation device that delivers combined occipital and trigeminal afferent stimulation for the treatment of MDD. Dr. Carpenter, thank you so much for doing this. Over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, let me get my slides up here. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. Can people see my slides? Great. I get the distinct pleasure to speak about home use neuromodulation devices. And I hope this is something that brings some data to you that you might not otherwise be looking at. I know many of us in psychiatry go through training and we never really learn much about home use devices, even though some of our patients might be getting their hands on them and using them anyway. But first, let me start with my disclosures because there are some relevant to what I'm going to be talking about here. I have consulting income from various TMS device companies that do EEG biomarkers, and also from a company called Neuraleaf, which sponsored a clinical trial that I'll be talking to you about today as well. I'm going to cover cranioelectrotherapy stimulation devices, CES, transcranial electrical stimulation devices, TES, to tell you what the difference is between those, and then peripheral nerve stimulation devices like external ones for vagus nerve, trigeminal, vestibulocochlear, and combined. So I'll start with CES, cranioelectrotherapy stimulation. This simply is a system that's set up with 2 electrodes on your head and device wires that go to a stimulator box that has some energy source, which is typically a small battery. And the electrodes can be different types, but they're often sponge electrodes that can be clipped on or placed on your head or clipped on the ears. And and these are non-invasive devices. Their history with the FDA is sort of interesting and complicated, and you may have heard your patients talk about the Alpha Stim or the Fisher-Wallace devices, and maybe even heard that those were FDA approved, and that there was a prescription for them, or maybe you've even written prescriptions for them. These are devices that had earlier versions that were actually marketed legally before the FDA started regulating medical devices. So they were grandfathered in, the newer versions, because they were similar to the predicate devices, and those predicate devices didn't have to do clinical trials to prove efficacy and safety. Those are the modern standards that the FDA applies for devices now, but they existed on the market. They were commercially marketed before 1976, so they're grandfathered in. And the indications you may have heard or seen for these sorts of devices are for treatment of anxiety, insomnia, depression, and pain. Although in 2019, the FDA actually changed the rules a little bit and said, in order to get a label for depression, you're going to have to do what we call a pre-market approval, which is back up and do the clinical trials, demonstrate efficacy and safety. So for these devices, most of them have kind of come along historically, been available. Our patients get them and maybe prescribe them, or actually any licensed professional can prescribe them. A physical therapist can prescribe them. It doesn't have to be a physician. And they do require these prescriptions, but you can get the prescriptions kind of downloaded online and not necessarily you can kind of put your name in and these devices come to you. So they are supposed to be monitored by a prescriber, but they are safe generally, and they generally have minor side effects. And those are typically related to irritation that happens under the electrodes. So there's different CES types of devices out there. Most of them look like this. They have a little stimulator box and various electrodes. And they have different, one of the things that's complicated and confusing for us about them is they are characterized by different types of wave features, the electricity that comes out of them. It is different in its pulse width, and the duty cycles, the on times and off times are a little bit different. The frequencies you can see vary here from 0.5 hertz to 100 hertz, a lot of them in the high frequency range. And then they have treatment timers so that they can be on for a certain amount of time when you do a stimulation. One device in this category called Modius Stress has some promising clinical trial results that I wanted to share with you. This is a device that has 2 electrodes that you place on the mastoid process down underneath your ear. It's got high frequency stimulation at 100 hertz, and you use it for 30 minutes. And they've done 2 pivotal sham controlled trials. These aren't kind of rigorous and with regard to the exact same methods at both places, but one was done in India, one was in UK, with slightly different dose strategies that they used. Each one had about 40, a little over 40 in the active and sham. And one of the studies, not the UK one, they didn't separate the active from the sham, but the India study did. And again, they demonstrated that they had relatively minor adverse events and none serious events that were related to this. So this is a device company, and you can see what that looks like there. That's continuing to work on developing this device. Another example of a CES device is this one I found on the internet called Cervella CES. This is makes claims that it's useful for depression, anxiety, and insomnia. And while I don't have any clinical trial data to share with you, what I thought was interesting to show is that this device is actually using this headset, an audio headset, to give this weak pulses of electric current. And most of these, or many of these, are evolving to have technology where they Bluetooth to a smartphone, and you can program your treatment sessions on the smartphone. And again, this is a device that recommends the 30-minute treatment sessions. And there are some randomized controlled trials, and they're summarized in meta-analyses. Again, not kind of the one large type that you would see for a pre-market approval, but they generally support efficacy in patients with anxiety. And again, the risks are fairly low. When we talk about transcranial electrical stimulation, the FDA differentiates this some from the CES devices. We're talking about electrical stimulation that's not at the threshold to cause an action potential to fire, but actually it's to kind of bolster the endogenous firing. So here you've got a quiet neuron, right? And you can see on the bottom we have a neuron without transcranial electrical stimulation, and there on top it's elevated a little bit. And then if you've got endogenous brain activity that already brings you to close to threshold, that's that blue line there. If you added the stimulation to it, you can cause it to go over the threshold and fire. And that's one of the kind of concepts underneath this, is that you're actually going to be just giving a push or an inhibition to prevent or push something to neurons to fire to get activity that you otherwise wouldn't. When transcranial electrical stimulation is given with these sponge electrodes, we talk about the location of them and the arrangement of them as a montage. And of course, you can set up your montage to target specific regions of the brain. And then we talk about two different types of current, either direct current, which you can see depicted here, which is an on-off, or alternating current, which is a waveform that looks like that. And those are abbreviated TDCS and TACS. And with these devices, there have been a lot of different pilot studies for a lot of different disorders. There were a handful of trials for major depressive disorder that did not have positive results. And then there have been a couple of recent trials that do have very exciting results. And there are still many, many more underway using TDCS, mostly and TACS as an adjunct to other brain treatments or activities or medications, and also to bolster learning and physical activity to enhance the effects of exercise and so forth. And some of these devices have the even though they don't have FDA approval in the US, they have regulatory approvals in other countries like the European CE mark, where these devices are approved for depression and chronic pain. So I was talking about montage, and of course, depending on how you set up your electrodes and how many electrodes, you can create a field with either a larger or a more focal area of electrical induction in the underlying cortical tissue. Here you can see a conventional anode cathode, and those are probably like 5 by 5 sponges that really are sponges that you dip in saline and put on your head and affix in a particular way. High definition is when you've got an anode surrounded by cathodes, or a cathode surrounded by anodes, and you're trying to constrain the field to a more focal area. And you can see some of the E-field modeling here to highlight that point. One study, one company that's been working with this technology is one that used to be called AlphaStim, and they've now gone forward with a device. Oh, sorry, this is Fisher Wallace with a device that I think they call Oak, which is actually a TDCS device. And this one they tested in a large randomized sham-controlled trial. Again, I'm sorry, I've just misspoken. This is an alternating current device. You can see it's wireless, and you can see the electrodes there. It's held on by this band, and I believe this can be recharged and responds to voice control. But this was a good, solid, large, triple-blind study with a good sham, and they dosed this stimulation as 20-minute sessions a day for 4 weeks. And they had the Beck Depression Inventory was their outcome measure. And I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but their primary outcome was really only at 2 weeks, the Beck Depression Inventory. They expected this to work really quickly. And it did actually work fairly quickly. At the end of 2 weeks, if you looked at the entire pool, the difference between the active and sham was 0.056, which is one of those unfortunate over p less than 0.05 values that we've seen over and over again in our neuromodulation studies. But if they looked at what they call the per protocol analysis, that was taking all the people that were 100% adherent with doing the prescribed number of stimulations, and each of their stimulations was 20 minutes long. When they looked in the active control for those, the significant significance, the difference between active and sham groups was highly significant. It was 0.005. And you can see here, I've got these two graphs with the BDI, the Beck Depression Inventory scores over time, and the two samples, the intent to treat and the per protocol. And you can see the difference in these numbers. The per protocol study kicked out some of the people. The active group went from 126 to 97, and the sham dropped from 129 to 101. Nevertheless, week 4 response rates for this technology, 65% active, which was, believe it or not, significantly better than the sham at 53%, and really a promising result for a TACS study. And a transcranial direct current stimulation study that I wanted to share with you is this company, Summa, and they conducted a randomized sham-controlled trial with 174. And these are, again, people with major depressive disorder on stable medications, a good double-blind trial. They dosed their treatment as 5 sessions a week. You didn't have to do it every single day, 5 out of 7 days for 3 weeks. So a total of 15 sessions, and then they continued with a reduced schedule, 3 sessions a week for the next 7 weeks. So they had a total of 10 weeks in their clinical trial. Each of these sessions was 30 minutes. And you can see for this one, the device, which is a direct current, has got the electrodes. You can't see them really that well, but they're in this cap. There's 2 of them there, and they're held down by the cap over their head, and then the patient's holding the stimulator device in their hand, and there's some white wires that are connecting. You can't see so well in front of her sweater there. But they use the Hamilton depression rating scale, and they are looking at week 10 outcomes. And they found a significant separation. If you look at this graph on the left, at the end of 10 weeks, difference between active and sham is different with regard to the reduction on total Hamilton score, and that's at p equals 0.012. Response rates were 54% for the active versus 32% for the sham. And there was a subsequent study published by the same group, Woodham and colleagues, and they took a subset of these groups, 77 from the UK, and followed them over time for another 6 months. And of those who had been responders initially, 90% maintained their response. They had an open label period for a while where the people who had got sham were able to get active treatment. Those people got well, and at the end of 3 months, they had 64% responders. At the end of 6 months, they had 76% response. So really an exciting and good-sized trial for us to look at in this category of low-intensity electrical stimulation, one with direct current, one with alternating. So what about other ways to stimulate the brain? If we're not going, what I've talked about just now is using electricity on the surface of the scalp to presumably use a mechanism that is impacting, either inducing or shunting current underneath those electrodes in an area that's directed by the anode and the cathode arrangement. And the idea is the cortical surface is what you are where you are inducing your current, or you are amplifying your propensity to activate current. A different way to get up into the brain would be through the cranial nerves, right? So we have these cranial nerves. This is the base of a brain we're looking at here. And these have connections to the brainstem, and really they branch off through various nuclei, including the solitary tract nucleus, to critical brain regions that are involved in psychiatric symptoms, mood, anxiety disorders. So we're seeing more and more neuromodulation devices that are using access through these cranial nerves to get to the brain. So we've got trigeminal nerve, and trigeminal nerve stimulation. There's already an FDA-approved device for ADHD called Monarch. There's one for migraine called Cephaly. There's one I'm going to introduce you to today, which is an external combined trigeminal and occipital nerve stimulation device. by a company called Neuraleaf. They already have approval with their device for migraine, and we've completed a multi-center clinical trial for major depressive disorder. And then there's vagus nerve, right? I'll remind you a little bit about vagus nerve stimulation and then talk about external or transcutaneous forms of vagus nerve stimulation. There's one FDA approved called GammaCore, and that's approved for migraine and cluster headache. There's a device called Bridge, which is stimulating auricular branches of the vagus nerve stimulation for opioid withdrawal. And then there's a device that's thought to work through the vestibular nerve stimulation. That's that CES device I just was telling you about a minute ago. So vagus nerve stimulation, just to remind you about the implanted version, this is a system that is comprised of a pulse generator and these lead wires that wrap around the left cervical vagus nerve. It's surgically implanted under general anesthesia. It is currently FDA approved for treatment-resistant major depressive episodes, both unipolar and bipolar. However, there is limited insurance coverage at present, and that's probably why most of you aren't prescribing it. I guess we could consider this a take-home device. It's implanted in a surgical theater, of course, and then in a doctor's office, just like you see here. It's programmed with a telemetric wand. That's kind of an old picture where we used to use Palm Pilots, and now we have tablets. We have electronic tablets like this and newer looking telemetric wand. But it's also approved for seizure disorder. And what I found out today that I wasn't aware of, maybe you aren't aware of, is that there's actually a vagus nerve stimulation device now called SetPoint, which is approved for rheumatoid arthritis. And I'll explain to you why that might be useful for rheumatoid arthritis. But what's really interesting about this and what really does make it a home use device is that once the doctor turns it on with this telemetric wand and programs it, stimulation continues around the clock 24 hours a day in a cycle that you set. And a typical cycle might be 30 seconds on, 5 minutes off, 30 seconds on, 5 minutes off. And if the patient needs to interrupt the stimulation, they can hold a magnet over the pulse generator on their chest. The battery life for an implanted device is maybe 10 to 14 years, depending on the model. And one of the reasons that we don't have widespread coverage by insurance yet is because the series of clinical trials that I was a part of as well, that were done to establish the efficacy and get the FDA approval, didn't include prospective randomized trial that had a significant difference between the active and sham at the trial endpoint. The trials ended up not showing what we expected at 3 months, but then when people continued over long term to have their VNS devices and there was sort of treatment as usual and physicians who were tinkering with the settings, there was increasing evidence from that study that there was efficacy. And then in a future study, a dose finding type of trial where we randomized people to 3 different levels, there was again suggestion of efficacy, but not separation from what we thought would be the sham. So now there's been this very large Medicare-sponsored trial, which is happening around the country in both unipolar and bipolar patients. And Medicare has basically said, if we can demonstrate efficacy in this randomized sham-controlled trial where patients are followed each for a year, that would influence their interest in covering it for depression. And then if Medicare covers it, of course, the other commercial insurance companies will fall in place. The unipolar side of this study is done, and it didn't meet its primary endpoint, but it had very positive suggestions on the secondary endpoints of efficacy. So we're hopeful that in time there will be coverage for VNS, and we'll wait to see what the results are for bipolar. But how else can you get to the vagus nerve without a surgical implant? That's what this talk is about, home use devices. Well, this is, again, cranial nerve 10, which has both motor and sensory function. 80% of the fibers, you can see in this picture how long this nerve is. It's it's the longest cranial nerve we have. 80% of the fibers are carrying information to the brain, a lot of them through the solitary tract nucleus. And that nucleus, solitary nucleus, as you can see here, connects with a lot of the regions and structures in the brain that are implicated in the treatment of mood and anxiety disorders. You can see connections to locus ceruleus, the thalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, dorsal raphe. So that may be one of the important mechanisms through which vagus nerve stimulation impacts the symptoms of depression. But it also has this incredible cytokine and inflammatory feedback loop where it's interacting with the peripheral immune system, and there's also a gut-brain axis. And so its effects on cytokines, macrophages, and these feedback loops are likely what has helped vagus nerve stimulation to show efficacy, or what's underlied, it has been underneath its efficacy for problems like migraine and certainly the rheumatoid arthritis, the most recent FDA-approved indication we saw. But it has many, many functions that balance parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So its effects can also extend to treatment of stress response and so forth. People are looking and exploring vagus nerve stimulation now with external devices to stimulate for a variety of different symptoms and disorders. And there are different ways you can reach it. You can try to get to it transcutaneously by stimulating right over the vagus nerve in the neck, but you can also get to a peripheral branch of it in the ear. There's an auricular branch of the vagus nerve stimulation here, and you can see it plotted and see the areas that correspond in the human ear. And that gives us an opportunity to stimulate without having a surgical implant. So today I did a Google search on transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation to see what devices, because every time I give this talk, there's like more and more devices that are coming out. It's so cool. And you can see a bunch of them here that I found on Google search. And again, I'm not intending to promote any particular brands here. I just wanted you to be able to see the range of devices and what they look like. So Terex makes one, and they make that for research. And that's a great product because they make really good sham. One thing about stimulating at the auricular area is you can sham very easily by, clipping your stimulator piece onto a different area of the ear that we don't think is innervated with vagus nerve branches. So there are all of these products that are mostly sold direct to consumers. They have claims that they improve sleep, reduce stress, they enhance focus, they improve your GI health. And again, I showed you that picture with all those afferents from those many, many organs to the brain through the vagus nerve. So it's not surprising that there could be some potential benefits to these different areas of health. So it's FDA approved, as I said, for cluster and migraine headaches. That's the gammaCore one. You give 2-minute treatments as needed to board a migraine, but you can also use it 2 times a day for prevention. And let's see if I have a gammaCore up here. I don't see one in here. Looks a little bit like one of these. It's handheld. But we do not have any of these external ones yet FDA approved for depression, unless we consider the bridge, which is approved for substance use for opioid withdrawal. That has some mechanism through the ear here. But first, I will give you a little bit of background about what we do know about the transcutaneous auricular VNS. First, there was a non-randomized controlled trial in some cohorts, and this was done in Chinese adults using 20 hertz frequency. And you can see it's pretty clever here. They developed a device that they could place that would touch all these different areas, the areas on the outside of the ear here where they stimulated if they wanted sham, and these areas in here internally in the auricular area if they wanted the active. So the device looked the same on both ears, whether it was active or sham. And they did a 4 to 6 milliamp, 20 hertz frequency, 30-minute sessions twice a day. And they had good outcomes. At 4 weeks, the active was superior to the sham. Again, this is not a randomized trial. It was first one cohort that did it for 12 weeks, and then another cohort that they did sham. So that was encouraging data. What else do we have to answer this question? It's benign. Should we prescribe transcutaneous VNS? Well, we have some evidence from various types of studies in healthy people that there are indeed activation of evoked potentials when you do transcranial stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, healthy volunteers. We see that in various EEG studies. We can see it in physiology studies. There are functional connectivity studies showing high frequency stimulation activating functional connectivity between cingulate cortex and other areas that are implicated in the treatment of depression and anxiety, and also in insula. And some of the pain and interoception circuits. We have studies that show changes in functional connectivity using transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation in patients with major depressive disorder and in patients with primary insomnia. So we have some of these mechanistic studies which are really exciting and promising. There's even a scoping review of transcutaneous auricular VNS suggesting some decent evidence. But when it comes to whether or not you should use it, I think it would be useful to follow the literature and look at studies like this one, which comes out of Felipe Fregni's lab, which is a systematic review. This one, I think, was published in 2024, last year. And they summarize the preclinical data, the clinical data, the neural, anti-inflammatory, and clinical effects of transauricular VNS for depression. And what they found is that there's, very mixed methods. There are like 5 clinical trials, and they all suggest some efficacy, but they really couldn't even be pooled for a meta-analysis. The preclinical studies that are available do suggest an effect on pro-inflammatory cytokines, and that could be how it's working to relieve depression. Again, we don't know a putative mechanism, but all in all, at this point, they conclude the data are a little bit limited to be really having it be a consensus-supported first-line sort of treatment. Again, the risks associated are so minimal that it's one of those things that, I wouldn't throw it out of my toolbox. I would certainly keep it there, but use it, in the appropriate context with the appropriate amount of education for my patients and with the right kind of consent, revealing, that the level of evidence supporting it is just emerging at this point. Okay, so what do we have? We have, I talked about this, this one here, the bridge, and I'll show you a little bit more about how that works, because that's working here on some of the auricular areas. We talked about gamma core for migraine. There's this device Cephaly, maybe you've heard about it for migraine. Both of those in the neurology space. Same with Monarch, which is trigeminal nerve stimulation for ADHD. That's FDA approved. That's one that you wear when you're sleeping. And then there's this Modius stress, which has got the mastoid process that got FDA approval. And I'm going to tell you a little bit eventually about a device which is now called ProLive. It was called Relivion, and that's FDA approved for migraine. First, we'll talk about Monarch. So this is trigeminal nerve stimulation. This was FDA approved by NeuroSigma in 2019, following a study in kids ages 7 to 12 who were medication-free who had ADHD. And this is a good randomized clinical trial, 62 in each arm. And they put this device on their head, and they wore it overnight for 4 to 8 weeks. So instead of having to kind of hold it on and apply it for a session, you can be passive and sleeping. And you can see here plotted are the differences between active to sham at week 4. And they had a significant difference between groups over time with a Cohen's d effect size of 0.5. The clinical global impressions improvement difference between them was highly significant, and a number needed to treat of 3. They also, which is great, had some mechanistic data. They had some resting QEEG data, and it showed increases in frontal power and frontal midline bands associated with the active stimulation, and that biomarker mapped onto the clinical improvements. So I'll pivot from there and introduce you a little bit to this device called Relivion, which is a company called Neuraleaf. And again, back to my disclosures, Neuraleaf is the sponsor of this clinical trial, and I was the lead principal investigator for a multi-center randomized controlled trial in depression, which was recently completed and with our results just published this year in actually just a month ago in the Brain Stimulation Journal. This is a device that, again, is FDA approved for migraine, but uses different stimulation pattern. The device itself is a headset that a person wears on their head, and there's little sponge electrodes in the front and in the back, and they're stimulating these branches of trigeminal nerve here that run across your forehead, and then also branches of the occipital nerve in the back. I see I have one out of order here, so I'm going to diverge and talk to you about Bridge, which is the opioid withdrawal device. This is a device that's considered a percutaneous nerve field stimulator. Now, this is interesting because it actually has, this is a disposable device, and it's kind of categorized by the FDA as an acupuncture device. And it's got this little light up here function in it, right? So that you transilluminate to see these blood vessels behind your ear. And then you place these little electrodes, which have a little bit of a puncture to them. And they are thought to work on branches of cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, and 10, plus the occipital nerve. A lot of innervation in that area. And this is one that you wear for up to 5 days, and then you dispose of it. And it's used to address acute withdrawal, and the effects are described as occurring within 20 minutes. So this is an FDA-approved device. I have never seen this used in real-life clinical practice. I wonder if anyone else is, maybe during the Q&A, you can tell me. Okay, but back to Relivion. Sorry, I had that last one out of order. Relivion, it's got a constant current at 80 hertz, and it's got variable intensities, and the intensities in the front electrodes and the back electrodes are changing in a sort of interesting synchronized way, which makes it the stimulation actually feel quite good on your scalp. It feels like somebody's running their fingers down the back of your neck and making the hair stand up. It's got these little wet electrode pads in it, and each channel has like a different time synchronization. You use this, you put this on your head. You don't have to be sleeping. You can do it while you're awake. Each session up to 40 minutes is how it's used. So a large randomized controlled trial was recently completed. This is a prospective multi-center trial. We had sites in mostly US, but also in Israel. And it was a double-blinded trial and then an open label phase afterward. Adults with primary MDD. And they had current episode up to 3 years with a Hamilton of 20, and they had to have not responded to an antidepressant medication with no more than 4 in the current episode, or they could have had non-response to 2 antidepressant trials with documented poor tolerability. And if they had psychotherapy, they could continue. In this study, we're looking at the change in depressive symptoms with the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, 17-item score from baseline to the end of week 8, which was a blinded phase. And then, of course, we were looking at safety, and the intervention is self-administered. We prescribed it to our study patients to be used 5 to 7 days per week, twice a day, typically 30-minute sessions. And they were supposed to have a 60 minutes plus or minus 20 per day. So 60, 80 minutes per day. This is the study flow. We had, after the double-blind phase, people went into an open label phase, and people who had been sufficiently adherent during the blinded phase were allowed to continue with open label. So you could have got active during the double blind and continue with active, or you could have got sham and then crossed over to active and had a period there. This was a group who had significant level of treatment resistance, not too much dissimilar from what you see in TMS clinical trials. There were, although there was a a 1.8 average number of antidepressants in the current episode that were considered inadequate. And these people had been sick for an average of 12, over a year, 12, 13.8 months. And all of them had medication treatment. By definition, a little bit more than half had psychotherapy. And we had the intent to treat protocol, which was people who had completed 80% of the prescribed treatments. But you can see that at baseline, the active and sham groups were equivalent on all of the measures of depression that we are looking at. The results from this study were positive, and this is really exciting for us. We're looking at the change in Hamilton from baseline to week 8 was significantly different between the two, with a change of 8.62 points in the Hamilton for the active group and a change of 6.01 points in the sham, and a significant difference of p equals 0.029. And there was effective blinding at the end of this. This is a great study to blind because both patients got an active, either active treatment, or even the sham had active stimulation, which ramped up for a while and was at an extremely low level. So patients weren't able to guess. Secondary outcomes in this were response and our remission rates, which you can see here. They were not significant, and the responder rate at the end of 8 weeks, but the remission rate between active and sham, 21.3 versus 6, was significant. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about another category of home use devices. And I'm also curious to know if anyone in our listening audience today uses these, but these are FDA cleared software as medical device. They're digital therapeutics. And I've got some listed here that have been FDA approved. And what's interesting about these is, unlike the devices that, many of the devices that I've showed you so far that are these stimulation devices, these are actually prescription devices because they've typically been gone through the process of demonstrating efficacy in controlled trials. There are a few of these which are not available as that the companies haven't actually even launched them, and some of them are in the process of being launched. But these devices are ones that people operate off of their smartphones typically, and they are approved to treat ADHD. There's one for PTSD called Nightwear, Reset, which does cognitive behavior therapy. There's a Reset version for substance use and one for opioid use. There are a couple that have a CBT for chronic insomnia. There's Free Spiro, which is a breathing exercise and biofeedback as an adjunctive for panic or PTSD. Probably a Rejoin for major depressive disorder is the most popular of these. I've heard about that and seen marketing and exhibits on that. And there's a Mama Lift Plus for, which is a software-based mobile behavior therapy for postpartum depression. So I'm going to wrap up now and hope we have an engaging question and answer period. The world of take-home devices is really an emerging field, and you know, even since I've put these slides together, you might Google something and find something new tomorrow, which many of these are making their way to the point of clinical trials and under FDA review. When our government's back up and running, hopefully the FDA will be able to review some of these things and maybe approve them or help the investigators get their next steps in line so that they can continue to develop their products. I will say that the regulatory pathway for these devices is just so, it's so complicated. And even when a device is approved, for example, for neurology, that doesn't mean that you can do a 510K and run a clinical trial for depression and then come in under the same product code. There are different product codes, different indications, and the FDA likes to see depression and other psychiatric indications studied differently. So the regulatory pathway is challenging for devices that want to be approved for depression, even if they already have their device approved for something else. So we want to look carefully at the pathway, want to look carefully at the evidence. One of the reasons that some of these things get approved with so little evidence is because they are so benign, the risks are so small, and sometimes people are doing that risk-benefit analysis and they go, geez, you know, the risks are so small, the efficacy might not be great, but hey, it's not going to hurt anybody, so let's put it through. And the risk with these TES, CES, and peripheral nerve stimulation is really quite low. I don't have neurofeedback slides here, but there are some really interesting neurofeedback devices being developed. They're mostly being used in offices. Maybe you've heard of Prism for PTSD. And I think eventually, if the companies can figure out ways to get those devices working at home, they've got great potential. And also digital therapeutics, I think maybe we're underusing them. I need to get myself involved and prescribe them for some patients and see how well they work for us. There are many non-pharmacological treatment options, and even if your patients are using medications, you know, these are promising adjuncts to consider. So I'm going to stop there and open up to your questions. I will stop my share, and hopefully, did that do the trick?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carpenter. That was incredible. Folks, if you have questions or comments, you can either put it in the chat or please raise your hand so we can enable your camera and mic. Okay, let's see. There's one question already. Related to the auricular branch, vagal nerve stimulation, and the bridge device, do you think stimulation via acupuncture could also help with MDD? This is from Hua Chai from
Oh, wow.
UCLA.
That's a really interesting question. You know, I'll first confess that I'm not familiar with the literature on acupuncture for MDD. I mean, if we think about the potential pathways, right? And again, I don't know enough about acupuncture to know is it how it works, and does it stimulate peripheral branches of those nerves? And you know, could you do transauricular stimulation with acupuncture? I think it's a really interesting question. What do you think? I don't know. I think it's really provocative. I love the question. It's a really interesting idea. I mean, I guess the doses of stimulation, I will say this as I'm thinking, I'm chewing on this question. A lot of these studies do show dose response relationships. And some of the studies start off, they're dosing too little, right? And then they like increase it to X number of minutes over more weeks and they get better results. And so I don't really know how you dose acupuncture and, you know, whether you would need more stimulation or the frequency of the waveforms to, you know, to generate the oscillations that are going to propagate a signal to the brain. But I don't know. Who knows? Really interesting. Oh, yes, you can connect a stimulator to acupuncture needle. Yeah, see, well, that shows how little I know about acupuncture. Somebody who knows about acupuncture should inform us here.
Hey, Yaakov, go ahead.
Hi, I'm raising my hand because I want to ask a question live. Fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Carpenter. I'm curious about your sample selection for the study. How come you chose a somewhat treatment-resistant sample for the study, and what implications does that have for where these types of treatments lie in the treatment algorithm for our patients?
Yeah, it's a huge question. So first of all, I will say, well, I can tell you what I think, and then the company may have thought differently about this. But first of all, getting patients that are off medications or treatment naive for a depression trial anymore is nearly impossible. It's really, really hard. And then sometimes when you do that, you're not that confident about the diagnosis. So people who have had a diagnosis and had some medication trials, maybe a medication trial worked for them in the past, or they had side effects, or so they don't want to be on it, or they were better and then they got worse, or you know, they're partially better, is much easier to recruit for first. And then I think if you think about our patients now and how you treat them, you know, often your patients do get a little bit of benefit from a medication and we're moving in with augmentations, we're not a big culture for de-prescribing, which probably, is something that we should do more of. Like when people aren't getting better with medications, to really, take them off and try something else. And these devices are a nice opportunity for trying something else. But so one is that, and then the other is, that there's this whole kind of group of patients that don't tolerate medications, and they tend to also find their way into studies that are treatment resistant. And you may not be aware, but even like the pivotal TMS studies, you could meet criteria to come in if you had failed antidepressant attempts because of poor tolerability. But we see those patients, right? I see patients who used to be able to take Effexor 20 years ago, and now the woman's postmenopause and whatever, she can't take it, can't tolerate it. Side effects are bad, blood pressure, whatever, cardiac side effects. So we have a lot of those patients who need something. And so I think that this was a very kind of realistic and common population. I also think that in the world of devices, there was an interest in trying to, for this particular study, to try to get patients who might otherwise be looking at those alternatives. They're thinking, oh, maybe TMS is next for me. Oh, VNS, ECT, and there's so many people around the world that can't access those treatments. So one of the goals was to try to tap into the patients who were looking for those sorts of treatments and match them so that we could see if we had an alternative that would work. And so now, what does that mean? If the efficacy is what it is, we have a significant study with superior remission, and we also had crossover data. I didn't have time to put all of my slides together from the paper that was just published in Brain Stimulation, but in the crossover data, more people were getting more better with more time using the device. So it looks really, really encouraging and a really sick sample. I'd be inclined to try it probably before I put somebody through TMS, just because of the convenience. But the truth of the matter is, and I'll say this as long as I live, it's all about access. It's all about how much something costs and how easily you can get it, right? And you can have a great treatment, but if people can't afford it or can't get it, then there's no point. And we don't know how this is going to play out. This is sitting in front of the FDA right now, and then it'll be up to the company to decide their business model. And psychiatry isn't used to having a prescription home use device, really. Major depressive disorder is big, so this will kind of be the first in that area. And I don't know how it'll work. I can think of like how it works when you have a sleep apnea machine or a nebulizer or something, but I'm not really sure how this will go. And hopefully they'll make it really affordable. I don't have anything to do with that. And it'll be really accessible so that people could even use telehealth to get evaluated. The device could be sent to them. You can, show people how to use it over video conference, and they could use it if they live 1 million miles away from a center that does TMS and ECT. They might have something that they could try. So I'm excited about that.
I also see Dr. Josh Berman has raised his hand. I enabled your camera and mic. So if you could just unmute yourself.
Hi. So I'm wondering, what percentage of these devices are in fact prescription, and how many are things that patients can just eventually access on their own, and how do we think about convincing the patients of the value of actually having some guidance in using them? I'm recalling that when some of these things first came out, I read about college students, sort of rigging up their own TDCS devices with 9-volt batteries because they thought it would be make them better cognitively when they were studying for exams. I wonder, were there any first manic episodes when that happened? Because in one of the original Frenny studies, there were actually some inductions of mania. But anyway, I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. There was one Focus. You're bringing me back to this famous one that I used to have slides on. There's this one called Focus, and people were using it to study for the SATs, and when they're trading on their stocks, and it was supposed to do cognitive enhancement, and a lot of these devices are really very primitive. So it wouldn't be hard to make one with, like a couple sponges and a 9-volt battery. So your points are a really good one. The prescription device, we have none for depression, right? So even though some of these devices are getting FDA approvals, prescription devices right now are limited to our digital apps on our phones. So in terms of neuromodulation devices, I think only a bridge for withdrawal is prescribed in psychiatry. Now, outside of psychiatry, when it goes to neurology, there's a couple. There's the migraine ones, there's, Cephaly, Gamma Core, and I misspeak because the ADHD Monarch is a prescription device. So we have Monarch for ADHD, and then there's a bunch of neurology ones, or a handful of neurology ones, and nothing yet for depression. All of the ones that are FDA cleared and available for depression are they're prescription insofar as you have to fill out a form and somebody licensed has to sign off, but they're not quite the same level of requirement for monitoring. And again, they're all quite safe, but some of them, like the one that I've been working on, when that comes out, it will come with specific instructions for patient monitoring. You'll actually even have a cloud dashboard where you can monitor the impedances and adherence, how often the patients use it. Because with these devices, the main risks you get into is that if they don't have good contact, there can be burns on the skin and irritation on the scalp, right? So if you're putting particularly a wet electrode on your skin and it's not properly wet or not making contact, or it's going through your hair and ramping up to try because the impedances are high, then you can get into problems with superficial burning and discomfort like that. So so because that's the case, the kind of properly regulated devices have all these built-in mechanisms so that the device is shut off, and so you can monitor these impedances and so forth. Does that help?
The devices, yeah. I mean, I feel like the devices themselves are probably, for the most part, quite safe. But I think the only risk, the burn risk that you mentioned, and I think with some of the vagal devices, there's some potential risk of syncope if you put them up too high. But
that's right.
But
that's exactly right.
But I actually think the biggest risk with some of these is people who have illnesses that may be more serious than they realize, sort of
Absolutely.
winging it. Rather than having somebody to guide them in their treatment.
It's a really good point. And with the focus thing, there's a blog site, and the people who used to wear these things for video gaming would blog all the time. And one guy was blogging that, he wore it for an hour, and they were blogging like their performance, and he was like, you couldn't talk for 3 hours afterward or something. And it just reminded me that you're shunting energy from one place to another with some of these devices. And, there is a potential for, there are some reported hypomania episodes. Yossi Burlow at Brown and a couple of us put a little analysis together summarizing. So if you are somebody who's at risk for mania, if you have bipolar disorder, that could be a problem. If you're at risk for psychosis, we really don't have good data to help us know what kinds of difficulty people get in. But I think you're right. The main concern is, can they be misused, used too much, too long, and could that get people into trouble? I think you're right. The devices and their side effects, like superficial irritation, are not very risky, but we have a lot to learn. And I think in general in psychiatry, we probably need to start to figure out how to monitor patients that are wearing these and document it. And are there interactions with medications where if somebody's on a lot of noradrenergic medication, sometimes with a lot of stimulation, they can get activated. Will we ever see those sorts of things? I hope we as a field are active in documenting our observations so we can learn.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Berman. And thank you, Dr. Carpenter. This was an incredible talk and definitely encourages all of us to consider all of these devices and the apps when we're talking to patients. So thank you. Thank you all for joining. This was an incredible session. We will see you all in a month, November 20th, for a talk on ketamine and esketamine. Thank you.